Yeah, and I'm just having flashbacks to chess as a child, Robert. The Stonewall is like was like the bane of every kid's existence. Everyone has had someone go like knight f3, knight e5, and you take it, f takes, you just get checkmated. That's just how it goes. So another win for Kostya. I think that setup that he's gone for has been highly effective in this match, especially d4, e3, f4 with that c1 bishop already developed. That's just great. Great idea.
Hey folks, in this video I'd like to share with you an opening that I've been studying and working on for the past couple of weeks. I think it's a pretty dangerous line for an unprepared opponent, especially in blitz and rapid, where players often rely on their instincts when developing their pieces and are not often super precise when choosing their setup. So the line is basically a hybrid between the Trompowsky, which usually starts d4 and bishop g5, and the Stonewall setup, which is d4, e3, f4. And I don't know if there's actually a name for it, but in my notes I've dubbed it the Tromp-Wall Attack, which is hard to say, and like the name suggests, is a pretty oppressive system. Because the whole idea is to just establish this knight on e5 and basically make it very difficult for black to play around this knight in this position, because either black has to live with this knight on e5, or they have to one day take on e5 and allow white to open the f-file with f takes e5. And whenever this happens, white almost always gets a pretty dangerous attack and lots of attacking chances on the king side. So while I'm definitely not a huge expert in this line, I've only been studying it for a couple of weeks, and I'm sure there's a ton of nuances that I'm not aware of yet. It was pretty successful for me in the recent Speed Chess Championship, and I do actually think that the line is good not just for blitz, but also in regular tournament chess. I think this could be a very viable weapon for someone that's just looking for some kind of system that you can follow where you don't have to memorize a bunch of moves, and it's more about just learning the setup and the idea and what you're playing for and the types of middle game positions that you're trying to get. Then obviously you have to know how to handle those middle game positions as well, which is something that we're going to get to in this video. So I want to show you guys the blueprint of this opening, what you're playing for with the setup. So we'll start with some model games and look at some key ideas to take away, and then towards the end of the video we'll look at some move order setups as well. Though if I do my job right for the first part, you'll see that it's really not about having to memorize a lot of specific lines, but more about understanding where the pieces go and what you're trying to achieve out of this opening. So with that, let's start with the first instructive game here, and this was actually a game where I was on the wrong side of this setup. And this was the game played last year that really turned me on to this opening, because we reached this position after 9 moves. My opponent, Grandmaster Bosiocic, just played his knight to e5, and all of a sudden I realized I had no idea what to do in this position. Now this was a G60 game, so not a blitz game. I had 60 minutes on my clock, and I still couldn't really figure out what to do, and in fact black's position was already pretty difficult here. So let's quickly go through the moves here to see how we reached that position. This game went d4, knight f6, bishop g5, d5, knight d2, g6, e3, bishop g7, c3. Here white is already starting to set up the Stonewall. Castles, bishop d3, not showing his cards yet, knight bd7, and now f4. So I played b6 here, knight gf3, bishop b7. Of course black has different ways to play here, and we'll try to get into all the different possibilities along the way. But here white played knight to e5, and after a bit of time I decided to play knight to e8, which is kind of a thematic idea in these positions to bring the knight to d6. The problem with a move like knight to e4, which is pretty typical for black, is usually white is going to play knight takes e4 here, d takes e4, and bishop c4, and this is kind of an annoying pressure for black, because of course we can't play f6 now, and the bishop on the diagonal is quite unpleasant, and white's idea is actually just to castle and maybe even push f5 and start attacking on the light square. So I definitely don't like black's position here, and if black plays something like c5, which I think is a normal move, then white can probably follow up with a plan like queen to f3. This is a very typical move in these positions. We're going to see this one a lot, as the queen on f3 is well placed. It stops knight e4 because we now control this square 3 times, and it supports a lot of attacking ideas like g4, or in this case after queen c7, I think the move h4 here is quite strong for white, and the idea is just to completely hammer down the king side. We're going to play h5 here, g4, White has a ton of attacking ideas in this position, and this is already just looking incredibly dangerous for black. If h6, white will just play bishop takes f6 and continue h5, and basically kill black on the light squares. So in the game after knight e8, my opponent played queen to g4, which I think was quite a decent move, attacking the knight on d7. Here after knight takes e5, fe, f6, white played the very smart move bishop f4, f takes e5, d takes e5, recapturing with the pawn, not trading off the bishop on g7, and leaving black with a bunch of passive pieces. And white went on to win very, very easily here. The advantage was already basically decisive. Instead of queen g4, it was also possible to play the move h4 here with a pretty thematic idea. In case black plays f6, white would then sacrifice the knight on g6, play bishop takes g6, and this is just a pretty typical mating attack. We're trying to play queen to h5. If fg, hg, the rook opens up on the h-file, and it's not exactly a easy win from here. We still have to play the attack accurately, but you know, the engines give white a decisive advantage. So after this game, I was impressed with this line that I started looking into it, and I was looking to see if this was actually something I could play, because I saw what a hard time I had from black's point of view, and I felt like, wow, this could really be something dangerous against a random player like me, international master, you know, who had no idea what he was doing beyond the typical setup of like a double fianchetto and putting the knight on d7. So the next model game I want to show was played by Super GM Dmitry Andreikin, and I think Andreikin is actually a really big fan of this line. It seems like he's played it a lot, and he's definitely a player whose games I would encourage you guys to go look up and then study. So here's a game I found that he actually played against one of my speed chess opponents, Tanya Sachdev, and after seeing this game, I kind of felt like, wow, I should really try to play the system in the match. So in this position, black has chosen kind of a different setup here. In the previous game, we saw that black had fianchettoed their bishop and developed the knight to d7. Here we can see that black has played with e6 and developed the knight to c6. And in general, the way I try to kind of think about this opening in terms of like move orders and setups is I really just try to focus on the setup itself. So there's a difference, of course, between whether black puts the bishop on e7 or puts it on g7. And then there's going to be a difference whether black puts the knight on c6 here or puts the knight on d7. Everything else more or less remains the same here, but there's going to be some nuances based on these different setups. So the main difference I just want to point out briefly with having the knight on c6 here versus having the knight on d7 is that here white really doesn't have to worry about this move knight e4. This is a typical counter that black looks for in order to trade off pieces in this kind of position, but with the knight on c6 blocking the bishop on b7, this is not a problem for white. So Andreikin actually had a couple of games that reached this position. Both I thought were really interesting. The first against Sachdev, who played h6 in this position. And here Andreikin makes a really interesting decision. He simply takes on f6. And as we'll see more and more lines, we'll see this move pop up time and time again. And this is actually one of the key points for white in the system. We're often willing to give up the dark squared bishop basically for anything. For a knight, for black's dark squared bishop, it doesn't really matter because the remaining pieces, white's two knights and the light squared bishop, coordinate very, very well, and in the long run, black is often just left with this bad light squared bishop because it's very hard to trade off this piece. So white's idea is to simply bring the second knight to f3, and if black wants to trade off the knight, that's absolutely fine. We'll replace it with the other knight. If black wants to trade the bishop, that's absolutely fine. Black is going to be left with the bad light squared bishop. So this kind of setup, two knights and the bishop versus black's two bishops and the knight, totally playable for white, and we'll see this time and time again. So here Andreikin plays the move queen g4, I think one of the strongest moves in the position. The queen is really well placed on g4, and white's idea here is to just start building up the kingside attack. The next move could be like rook f3, for example, followed by rook h3, then the other rook can come in. White can certainly play a move like king to h1, the second knight can use the f3 square, and we often see white playing ideas like queen h3 or queen h5, followed by flinging the g-pawn. So there's a lot of different attacking ideas. One thing I would really encourage you guys to do after watching this video, number one, download my notes that are in the description if you want to see all the games and all my analysis on this line, and then put it into your own ChessBase file or study. Maybe try to look up some more games and really try to get a feeling for how these positions are played, because it's not enough to just reach this kind of middle game. You then need to know how to proceed and how to play out the attack. So I'll just show a couple more moves here. Black played bishop e7, white followed up knight f3, f5, queen went back to h3, black traded on e5, bishop d6, and here white makes a real interesting move, knight f3, actually avoiding the trade. According to Stockfish, it was already very strong just to play the immediate breakthrough g4. And in general, when black has tried the setup with f5, g4, this pawn break is going to be white's main idea, so this is the one we're playing for. Sometimes you might want to prepare it with king h1, rook to g1, but in this case it's not really necessary, as white's queen is just kind of trying to get in on the light squares. So for example, takes on g4, rook f8, queen takes f8, queen takes g4. Basically really bad position for black. If black finds a way to not get mated, he'll probably have to trade queens, and then that endgame is going to be pretty bad for black as well. So overall, really nice position for white. But I like the way Andreikin played it. He simply pulls his knight back, knight f3, queen f6 is played, and now simple move king h1, and he's just preparing rook g1 and g4. After a5, typical plan to try and trade off the bishops. White played rook g1, bishop a6, trades these off. At this point, it doesn't even matter that black has traded off the bad bishop. g4 opens up the g-file, and it's actually kind of a decisive attack already. Rook a g1 is coming, knight e5, and yeah, black is not going to be able to defend. The knight on e5 is simply so strong in this kind of position, attacking all these critical squares, and black has basically just too many weaknesses to hold this one. So from the same position, Grandmaster Gunina tried knight takes e5, f takes e5, and knight e4. Again, kind of a typical idea for black trying to trade off pieces and equalize, but in this case it simply doesn't work. White plays bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, and now bishop takes e4, d-e4, and queen g4. Typical idea, simply going after this loose e4 pawn, and black just doesn't have a good way to defend it. The game continued takes, e3, knight e4, super simple. If black wants to trade off their good bishop now, then white will play queen takes e4 and slowly pick up the pawn. King h8 was played, rook a1, and white was already completely winning here, just winning this pawn, although the game later ended up drawn. So once you get to a position that kind of looks like this, or the first position we looked at, white is basically already doing well, and I hope you guys are able to kind of handle these positions with confidence. But let's look at a couple more games that I think highlight some interesting motives and ideas that white can play for. So in our next game here, black has opted for a very classic Queen's Gambit declined type of setup with knights on f6, and here the knight is on d7 with e6 and bishop e7, and of course this bishop fianchettoed on b7. And at the end of the video, we're also going to talk about different move orders in the opening and different things that black can try against the Trompowsky. I'm not a huge expert, but I'll give you guys my take on it. Let's quickly run through the moves here just so you guys can see how this position occurred. This one started d4, knight f6, bishop g5, d5, knight d2. I'll talk a little bit about the differences here between playing e3 first and knight d2, but long story short, I kind of like starting with knight d2 more. In this case, black played knight d7, and this is one of the differences between the regular Trompowsky and this opening. In the typical Trompowsky, when black plays d5, the classic idea has always been to simply take on f6 and double black's pawns. And of course these positions are playable, but this is taking the game in kind of a different direction than we want to take it. So knight d2, and a lot of players play knight d7 exactly in this position because they feel like, well, if white didn't take on f6 and double my pawns, then let me reinforce the knight and get ready to take back with the other knight. So here e3, e6, bishop to d3. Once again, I personally like delaying f4 until the last possible moment, because we kind of want to see how black sets up first, and we don't necessarily want to play f4 in every single position. I'll show you guys some positions where I would advise you to play f4 only with caution, because there are definitely some move orders against which f4 is not going to be super safe. So in general, I like playing bishop d3 and c3 first, and only then following up with f4, but there are different move orders. In this case, white can play f4 in this position, which is totally fine. Black plays c5, c3, b6, and hopefully it goes without saying, but this position can be reached in a variety of move orders. A lot of players will play b6 and bishop b7 and only then develop the knight to d7. Some players will play c5 early, and I'll talk about the early c5 a little bit later, as I think this is one of the more critical move orders. So here white goes ahead and plays knight to e5, and note that white often wants to do this before castling, as this gives us a couple of options, a couple of extra options I should say, when playing the position. Mainly with queen f3 and castling queenside, this is definitely an option that white looks for in many different situations. So in this next game here, which was played between Grandmasters Mohr and the well-known Vichy Anand, in this position black castled, and here white played the very accurate move queen to f3. And I'm highlighting this one here because if white did not play this move, if we played a move like castles, for example, then black has a typical equalizer here, knight to e4. And because the bishop on b7 is supporting this knight, this one is playable, but I don't think white gets much of an advantage here. I think it's going to be very close to equal. Still a playable position. That's the beauty of this line. Even if things don't necessarily go your way in the opening, worst cases, you're going to get an equal position that you can totally still play. But I do think that queen f3 here is the more accurate way to play this, not allowing the knight to e4. In this case, black played the move h6. I want to quickly point out that if black played knight takes c5 here, f takes c5, and knight e4, there's some tactics that are really important to watch out for here. Number one, if we play bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, and then we try to win the pawn with knight takes e4, d4, bishop takes e4, this is simply failing to queen h4 check, and white loses. So watch out if your king is on e1, try not to blunder this one. So instead, in this position, instead of bishop takes e7, which would kind of be the usual move, white should instead play bishop f4, a very, very strong move, keeping the dark squared bishops alive and keeping a grip over the position. Now that we got f takes e5, we're generally very, very happy with the structure. And if knight takes d2, king takes d2, this is actually a great example of a case where the king is perfectly safe in the center. Black has literally no counterplay. This pawn structure is incredibly solid. And if c takes d4, hopefully it went without saying, we're going to go e takes d4, keeping the center secure. I should quickly note while we're on this topic, in general, when black has played c5 and we've gone c3, if they take on d4 and you have a choice of which pawn to take, in general, we're going to be wanting to take with the e pawn here, as this opens up the e file and gives white's rooks kind of a future purpose. So if we can get away with it, we usually want to go e takes d4 in these kinds of positions. Now, one quick note on this position, whenever black plays this move a5, kind of insinuating that they want to play bishop a6, a lot of times you can allow this to happen and either trade off the bishops because it doesn't bother us that much when we still control the e5 square, or we can retreat the bishop to c2. But a typical idea is to simply play the move queen to e2, which kind of develops the queen. It allows white to castle queenside if that's what we want to do, and of course stops the idea of bishop a6. So this is just one that I wanted to mention as a move to keep in mind. White is often meeting this idea of a5 with this queen e2 because it kind of puts the ball back in black's court. Now you have to make a move, you have to decide where to put the king, and of course it's not so easy for the second player. So after queen f3, Anand played h6, and this is the kind of position where you definitely could consider bishop takes f6. I think this move is always valid once black has castled. If black has not castled, then bishop takes f6, gf6, you lose your control over e5. That can be kind of unclear, but when the king is on g8, we're almost never worried about g takes f6. So here bishop takes f6 was certainly possible, but white comes up with a much stronger idea, h4. And this one, of course, is only because we left our king on e1 and the rook on the h file is ready to open up. So of course the plan here is to possibly castle queenside. If black takes this bishop on g5, this is kind of like a typical fishing pole idea. It's basically just a crushing attack. There's little need to calculate this one. Everything is in amazing position to checkmate the black king. Instead, in the game, black played knight e8, trying to ease some of the pressure, and white found an absolutely fantastic sacrifice, bishop takes h6. So definitely keep this idea in mind. After g takes h6, queen h5, White's attack was simply overwhelming with rook h3, rook g3 coming, g4, g5 coming. You guys can play through the rest of the game in the notes, but long story short, the position was totally crushing for White. So going back a couple of moves, after castles queen f3, I already like this position for White. I think we have some really nice attacking chances with this plan of h4 and castling queenside. So going back to this position before Black has castled, some players might be quite clever and insert the move h6 early here. And like I mentioned, if Black hasn't castled yet, it doesn't always work out to take on f6, as Black can definitely consider going g takes f6 in these kinds of positions. Although in this case, I think knight takes f6 would also be quite possible. So in this case, White should first wait with bishop to h4. And here after castles, if White makes the kind of typical move queen to f3, well, now Black is able to get away with knight takes e5, f takes e5, and knight e4. And the difference here is that our bishop on g5 doesn't have this key f4 square. So White would have to play bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, but then we're back to this line where we can't take twice on e4 because of queen h4 check at the end. So what to do? Well, there was a couple different options, but I found one game played by Grandmaster Anatoly Lein that was really interesting. And here he played the move bishop takes f6. So totally unprompted, he already lost the tempo with bishop to h4, but now that Black has castled, White can definitely take on f6. We're not worried about g takes f6, and he decides to trade off his kind of bad bishop in the position. And I think this is an absolutely brilliant decision and 100% the way to play this position, because he doesn't allow Black this kind of equalizing move, knight to e4. So Black played knight to f6, White played queen f3, very natural move. Now knight e4 does lose a pawn. There were other ways to play the position too. Actually g4 was totally possible here, followed by moves like rook to g1, queen f3, and castling queenside. I think the move queen e2 here was also quite interesting. Again, preparing castle's queenside, and then simply launching the pawn forward with g4 and g5. And the fact that Black has created this hook with h6 is very important for our position, as this is what is going to allow White to open up some lines. So a couple of important details there. Make sure to keep queen f3 in mind and look for these h4 ideas if you haven't castled yet. This is really the most dangerous way, in my opinion, to play this position. And always be willing to give your bishop on f6. The next game I wanted to show is this game I actually saw last year between Carlsen and Grandmaster Cuenca Jimenez. I think this was a Blitz event. And Magnus played this one in a really interesting fashion. Here he goes e3, Black has already played e6, bishop e7, bishop d3, castles c3, b6 is played, and here Magnus goes f4. Now Black plays bishop b7. In case of bishop a6, which is definitely a thematic idea, I think White can probably just back it up with bishop to c2, although taking on a6 and misplacing Black's knight, followed by kind of typical play with knight f3, knight e5. I think this would be quite reasonable for White as well. But I think bishop c2 is probably the more ambitious response. And here we're not super bothered by the fact that the bishop is covering this diagonal, as we can kind of revert to the other plan of bringing this knight to e5, putting the queen on f3, and then castling queenside if we need to. And that's a big if, because the king is often safe on e1, and so what we'll see a lot of players do is make a lot of moves without castling, and then castle when it's the clearly most useful move in the position. In the game, Black put the bishop on b7, and here Magnus made a move that I remember thinking was shocking. Bishop takes f6. Even worse than the other game, here White is totally unprompted, but he takes on f6 exactly the right moment. And I checked the game with Stockfish, and indeed, this is the best move. Had White played the normal knight gf3, sure, Black could play knight d7, but it would be even stronger to play this move knight e4. Again, a very annoying and kind of equalizing move that White is often trying to avoid. So Magnus, really on top of the details in this position, takes on f6 in exactly at the right moment, and then he follows up with knight gf3, but there are many other ways of playing this position actually. For instance, I thought queen c2 here is quite a logical move, simply attacking the pawn on h7 and inducing a weakness from Black. Either black has to play h6, which as we saw before is going to run into white playing h4, g4, g5 and opening lines this way, or black plays g6 in this position, which is obviously going to be a target to the h-pawn as well. So black can't really win in this structure and has to kind of weaken their position regardless. So I think this was one interesting choice. But in the game, after knight f3, c5, Magnus played h4, black played h6, which I think was not a good idea, just the immediate g4. And there was just a couple of moves and white's position was just completely crushing. Now this was just a blitz game, but this was like a very strong GM playing with black, and you can see kind of the dangers of this line when a player is not super familiar with all of the nuances. So bishop e7 was played, g5, h5, black tries to keep things locked up, but of course g6, white doesn't give black a chance to solidify, immediately pushes this one through, takes, knight d7, knight g5, and the game was already completely over here with queen threatening the h5 pawn, e6 hanging as well, black's position just totally collapsing. Alright guys, so now let's talk about some specific move orders. Now that we know the types of positions and setups that we're playing for, let me break down exactly how we're going to try and get there. So of course the Trompowsky typically starts with d4, knight f6, bishop to g5. Here black has a number of options. We'll talk a little bit about my thoughts on moves like g6, e6, and knight e4, which are going to avoid this system. But generally d5 is considered one of the absolute big main lines. And this is the way that a lot of players approach this position. So here there's two ways to play it. You can play with knight to d2 first, or you can play with e3. In most cases, it's going to lead to the same thing, so it's not going to matter too much. The different moves offer different options for white. A few that I'll point out actually is that if you start with knight to d2 and black plays c5, here one thing I noticed is that Andreikin, who's a real specialist in these systems, really likes to move d takes c5. So he's a hardcore specialist of knight d2, he almost always plays this one, and he likes taking on c5 here with ideas like e6, e4, bishop takes e5, queen e2. Kind of a funky setup. I honestly haven't looked into this one a whole lot. I think the idea is maybe a castle queenside, I'm not totally sure, but I just want to mention this one as Andreikin is like honestly one of the world's absolutely strongest blitz players, so if this is something he's playing in blitz, it's definitely worth paying attention to. Personally, I think we can just play e3 here, so again, the move order to me doesn't matter too much. You can also start with e3 and then on c5 play this move knight to d2, and the reason we play e3, of course, instead of c3 is that we do want to take on d4 with the e-pawn, so it's very important to push e3 first and not c3. Now with e3, we also give ourselves the option to take on f6, and I have seen some players that don't want to take on f6 in this position, but after e3, c5, once black has kind of loosened their pawn structure a little bit, they will go ahead and take on f6 here, and this is totally viable. Here e takes f6 is considered not as solid for black, because in these cases I think black often wants to put the pawn on c6, but here once black has played c5, eventually these pawns will get traded and black will be left with this isolated pawn on d5. So nowadays many players are actually playing g takes f6 here, and I think these lines are very combative and very playable. They definitely are not for everyone, but I just wanted to point this out as this is definitely an option worth exploring if you do kind of like these funky positions where we've given up our bishop but we've kind of weakened the opponent's structure long term. So generally I like knight d2 here. It also avoids knight e4 lines, which black might switch over to if you play e3. After c5, e3, black has a couple of options to avoid this system altogether. I would say the main one they can play is if they start with c takes d4 here, or if they play knight c6, c3, and then take on d4 in this position. This is just going to transpose. And here if black plays bishop f5, for example, I really don't think it makes sense to play f4 anymore. I think we can't really get away with this one. It's just going to be too weakening, and black just has too good control over the e4 square. Instead, I'm just going to show you guys a couple of moves of this game between Richard Rapport and Karjakin that I thought was a very, very nice example of what white should play here. So knight f3, e6, and then Rapport just plays a simple and thematic move, knight h4. Typical idea going after this bishop on f5. Bishop g6, he traded this one off. black took, and white played bishop d3 here. And I think white is actually just having a simple and safe advantage here with the two bishops. It's not the super impressive, Tromp-Wall attack that we're going for, but it is a nice position, and I think we should be quite happy to play this one. So I'd encourage you guys to play through that Rapport game when you get a chance. And I included another game in the notes between Laznichka and Arishchenko that I thought was pretty interesting as well. So this is one line where black can kind of avoid this system altogether. Black can also play the move queen b6 here. This is a very typical move. Nowadays, I believe the main theory is to play queen to c2 here. I'm not going to get into this one mainly because I'm not a huge specialist in these lines. I just haven't looked into it. I would probably play queen to b3, which I think is a perfectly reasonable move. And there was one interesting game I saw where black played c4 here, white backed it up, queen to c2. Let me note quickly that bishop f5 is a common blunder in these positions because white will simply take, and then on queen takes b2, the rook is entrapped, so watch out for this one. If black plays a move like e6, white's idea here is to break with e4, and this is kind of a nice pawn break for us. So there was one game I saw where black played e5. I thought this was kind of an interesting choice. White took on e5, knight takes e5, knight f3, takes, and we kind of got this weird structure where black has given up the d4 square, and it ended up being really, really good for white. So this is not a very typical structure, but I just wanted to highlight this one as it is the type of structure where white has a very pleasant position. White continued with just knight d4, bishop f3, and yeah, just had really, really pleasant play against this pawn on d5, which kind of acts like an isolated pawn in the position as can never be defended by another pawn. Okay, so let me show you guys a couple of move orders where we really have to be careful about playing f4. In this case, when black has played c5 and knight to c6, here we would play c3, let's say e6, bishop d3, and bishop to e7. It's totally possible to play f4 here, but I just want to point out a couple of positions where it might be a little bit risky. So black often has these ideas to play this move queen to b6, and if there's any move that's going to kind of kill this line, it's going to be one of these queen b6 lines. Now if black plays b6 at any point, or like knight d7 then b6, we're generally pretty safe to play f4. I don't think there are any cases where it's not going to be good, because of course b6 blocks the queen. But a lot of these critical lines take advantage of the fact, of course, very logically, that white developed the bishop super early and now has to spend the tempo defending the b pawn. In this case, white can go rook to b1. Rook b1 is going to be the usual move. And in general, I'll just say that in blitz, I'm often not worried about these lines because if you think about it, when you play a blitz game and your opponent is playing some kind of unusual setup, you're not really going to invest a lot of time trying to refute the opening right out of the get-go, especially with black. A lot of times, a lot of these critical lines we're going to see like queen b6 and some like knight g4 stuff. These lines are so hard to find for a human over the board that in a blitz game there's like zero chance your opponent is going to find it. And I remember thinking back to my own game, I had some like concrete options in the opening that I could have tried, but I remember thinking like, wow, I would have never considered any of these moves over the board, not knowing what the computer says in a position. So I'd really encourage you guys not to worry about what the engine thinks about a lot of these positions, but actually keep in mind that chess is a very difficult game for most humans, and a lot of players are again just going to be relying on their natural instincts. If they're a Queen's Gambit Decline player, they're going to play a QGD setup. If they're a Grunfeld player, they're going to play a Grunfeld setup. If they're a King's Indian player, they're going to put their bishop on g7. In general, people aren't super concrete in the opening. They have some kind of general idea of what they want to do against d4, and they stick with it, and this line kind of takes advantage of that. So this is one of the lines where I think the engine shows this funny idea to play h6, bishop h4, and g5, and apparently this works for some concrete reason, but obviously no one would ever find this over the board. It's like such a weird idea. And then after bishop g3, I mean, the line is super complicated, and white isn't actually any worse here objectively. It's just leading to a total mess. So in general, I would totally be willing to take the risk that the opponent is not going to know this random stuff, and I'm going to play this line. But if you are a little bit worried and you don't want to play something that might lead into this mess, I do want to say against this setup, it's totally reasonable to simply play knight gf3, putting your knight in front of the f-pawn. Another Russian grandmaster, Artemiev, is a really big fan of these positions and in general scores very well with them. Whether the knight for black is on c6 or d7 doesn't really matter. And so if you're interested in something slightly safer but still has some strategic venom, I think this setup is totally viable as well. Here, for example, castles, b6. White can again play knight e5 in this kind of position, leading to a somewhat different structure we're forced to take with the d-pawn here. But after knight d7 takes f4, I think this is actually a pretty pleasant position for white, with ideas of bringing the queen to h5, the knight to f3, and playing against black's bad light square bishop. So this one is totally playable as well, but if I was you, I would stick to the f4. I would take the risk. Once you plant the knight on e5, the position is so good that I think it's definitely worth it. So this is probably the main position where I would be really nervous about playing f4. Here black has gone with fianchetto setup, so let's quickly run through the move order. This was d5, knight d2, g6, e3, bishop g7, c3, castles, bishop d3, and here black plays c5. If black plays knight d7, I would just go ahead and play f4 here. I think this one is quite playable for white. But if black starts with c5, keeping the knight on b8, this is kind of the worst possible hybrid of all possible setups, because here black has this bishop on g7 on the diagonal, the queen can come to b6, the knight can come more actively to c6, and this bishop on c8 is covering the g4 square, which means that black is going to have this knight g4 idea in a lot of positions. So if we play f4 and allow queen b6, rook b1, knight to g4, I think even this position, if you got this in a game, is not necessarily going to be a big problem, because it's going to be very difficult for black to follow up accurately. But the engine really hates this for white, so I think I should just do my due diligence and just point this out. This could be a real problem. If you do get this, I would just play queen e2 followed by h3 and kind of force your opponent to show their cards, because it's really hard to play like this with black from the opening. You know, you're kind of throwing your pieces out randomly, and you really have to make sure that your counterplay somewhat sticks, because if black is just forced to go back, white is just going to develop normally and have a really nice position. So what I'd like to note is that in this position, I saw that my opponent from the first game, Grandmaster Bosiocic, he had this position in a game last year, and he opted for knight to e2. So even he didn't want to play f4 in this position. That game continued knight c6, castles, and e5. And here I thought he played a really instructive game, d takes c5, just grabbing this pawn on c5. It's not going to be easy for black to defend this one, as white can just back it up with b4 whenever. And after h6, he simply took on f6 here, bishop takes f6, and now really important move e4, cracking black's position open on the light squares. And then after bishop e6, takes, bishop c4, and knight to g3. White had other options as well. The knights came to e4 and then to d6, and basically white already had a really pleasant position here. So of course black could have played this one differently, but I think if your opponent is really in tune with the move order and manages to reach this position, and you smell a rat and you think you're about to get hit with f4, queen b6, then maybe it's worth to avoid this one and play a move like knight to e2, which seems quite interesting. You can also develop the knight to f3 in these positions. In general, this is a very solid setup for white here. You can castle, play queen e2, a4. It's very similar to the London system. In fact, it's almost identical, except the bishop is on g5. But what can you do? We can't get a winning advantage in every game. And if we do get this one, I still think it's fully playable, so I'm sure you'll do absolutely fine. Lastly, after knight d2, knight d7, e3, black can play this move e5, which I've almost never seen. When playing this line in many blitz games, for the most part, I'll see one of these setups with g6, bishop g7, or e6, bishop e7, kind of like we started looking at the beginning of the video. But I do just want to point out this line e5, as it does kind of stop our Stonewall attack idea. Here I think white should play the move knight to f3, and kind of invite black to advance with e4. Here the knight will jump into e5. Black really doesn't want to take this one and allow d takes e5. Probably bishop d6 will be played. And then after knight takes d7, bishop takes d7, and c4, we get kind of a French-like position, c6, queen b3, but it's very important, of course, that our bad bishop has been developed outside the pawn chain. I don't think white actually has any kind of real advantage here, but I think it's a very playable position, and again, it might be equal, but if we get something that's equal and even slightly more comfortable for white, then I already think that's kind of a win in the opening, because that's what chess is all about nowadays. Black can really equalize in many different positions, so it's all about getting a game that's playable, where you understand the plans and ideas that you're going for, and where you know how to kind of pose problems for the opponent. So this is kind of an interesting option for black if you're sitting there thinking you have no idea what to do against the system. This is a pretty interesting one you can try to kind of avoid the whole thing altogether. Lastly, guys, let's talk about some of black's different options here. Now, as I mentioned, there's g6, e6, and knight to e4. Now, on g6, a lot of players would just go ahead and take on f6 here. E takes f6 and play this setup with e3. I think this is very playable, especially in blitz and rapid. It's a very, very simple approach for white. You simply give up the dark squared bishop and you make your light squared bishop into an absolute monster. The bishop goes to g2, this knight comes to e2, this knight comes to d2. You castle kingside here, you play c4, rook c1. It's a very simple approach and very, very easy setup. Of course, you can also start with knight to d2 here, bishop g7, and something like c3. But if your opponent decides not to play d5 here and play something like d6, then of course we're not going to get our tromp wall set up with the knight on e5, and we're going to have to play some kind of different setup here. Now, this one is often favored by King's Indian players, so this is something to watch out for. If your opponent is a King's Indian player, they can just play this and kind of avoid your favorite setup. But again, it's kind of an equal position and very, very playable for white. You can play with e3, you can also play it with e4. These positions, there's lots of room to explore here. Again, I'm not a huge expert on all of these different Trompowsky lines, so I'm sure there's better sources out there than this video. That'll be up to you guys to kind of learn about it. e6 is another option that black can play. Once again, you can go for knight d2 and try to get this setup, and you might get it if your opponent plays d5, but if they play a setup with c5, b6, bishop b7, and eventually d6, then you won't get your setup, and again, the position will be pretty close to equal. The main line, I believe, in this position is to play e4, and then after black plays h6, we can't allow bishop h4 g5, as black will take the pawn, so we have to take on f6 here. Queen takes f6, and white does quite, I would say, decently in this position. We've given up the dark squared bishop, but on the other hand, black's queen on f6 is kind of in the way of black's own bishop, and here white often tries to develop an initiative with knight c3, even queen d2, f4, knight f3 in this kind of play. So this is totally playable as well. And lastly, black can play this move, knight to e4. This is a very viable system, a big main line. Again, I don't know a whole lot here. Personally, I would play bishop f4 in this position, and then on c5, I would go f3. And there are different lines here, but one thing I've learned is that if black goes queen a5 check, you play c3. If they play queen b6, we play bishop c1. And a lot of times we want to advance d5 once this knight has been kicked away from the e4 square. So for example, queen a5, c3, knight goes back, d5, e6, e4. And I think this is a pretty healthy setup for white. The knight often tries to use the c4 square, and there are some interesting lines here. For example, takes, d6. Queen d2 is being played nowadays, bishop e7, c4. Going for this endgame, takes, knight takes d2, where white might have a slight strategic advantage because of the pawn on d6 is kind of a weakness. Again, for the millionth time, I'm not an expert on these classic Trompowsky lines. I'm sure there are better sources out there. You can also play d5 in this position, and like I mentioned, we meet queen a5 with c3, we meet queen b6 with bishop to c1. In any move order, if they play queen a5 check first or second, this is how I would do it. Queen a5 here, we would play c3, and then our plan is to play f3 and e4. So either this way or starting with f3 might be a little bit more accurate. That's how I would approach this position. There are, of course, other lines. It would be really hard to cover everything, but if there's a line that I haven't covered and you're not sure about, feel free to leave a comment down below and I'll do my best to respond to everyone. But for now, let's review some of the main plans and ideas that we talked about in this video to give you guys kind of a summary and a wrap-up of everything that we discussed. And then at the end, I would highly encourage you guys to take a look at the description, find the link to the PGN, download that, and play through some of the games multiple times, and do some of your own analysis to really get your own experience into the position. So let's review some of the main plans that we're looking for once we've established the setup with the knight on e5. Number one, we want to bring our queen in, maybe queen f3, queen h3. We want to use the g-pawn, looking for g4, g5 ideas. We can also think about putting the queen on g4 and h5, castling kingside, and doubling the rooks on the f-file and building up this way. Or we can think about playing a setup with h2, h4, and then castling queenside. This can also be very, very dangerous. Some general rules to remember about this system: if black exchanges the knights with knight takes e5, we almost always want to go f takes e5 and open up the f-file. So the only reason we wouldn't do this one is if there was something tactical going on. If black ever plays c takes d4 in the opening, we usually want to meet this one with e takes d4, opening up the e-file and keeping our grip on the e5 square, and also keeping the queen side very, very solid with this b2, c3, d4 pawn chain. Next, if black plays a5 in the opening, we often want to meet this with queen e2, stopping bishop a6. And if black plays f5, trying to blunt our light squared bishop, then the main plan usually becomes the pawn break g2, g4, sometimes prepped with king h1 and rook g1, but this isn't always necessary. And finally, guys, some move order tips. When black plays bishop b7 and knight bd7, kind of with a queen's gambit decline type of setup, this is where you have to watch out for knight e4 ideas, so make sure to put your queen on f3. Always remember that bishop takes f6 can be an option, but mainly once black has castled kingside, as then g takes f6 is not really going to be possible. And you can do this one unprompted, it doesn't really matter. And this is often a very typical idea and move that you can just rely on. Next, you should delay castling if you want to play for h4 ideas. In general, we kind of want to castle later in this position, as in many lines it might be really, really useful to keep the king on the center and keeping your rook on the h-file, so you can play some of these fishing pole h4 ideas, or even just castling queenside and then getting your second rook into the attack that way. And lastly, playing f4 is often the riskiest when black hasn't played b6 or knight bd7 yet, as this allows black to play queen b6 and knight g4 ideas in the opening, which can totally bust our setup, so make sure to watch out for those. Alright guys, that's going to wrap it up for this video. Hopefully you found this opening instructive. I've, like I mentioned, been really enjoying it a lot in my blitz and speed chess games. I think it's a very, very dangerous setup when the opponent doesn't really know what you're going for, and I hope you guys get a lot of crushing wins with it. If you have any questions on anything I discussed in the video, please feel free to leave a comment down below. And if you have any nice wins with this opening, I would love to see them and maybe even include them in a future video. So feel free to post a link to the game either here on YouTube in the comments, or you can send me a message in the ChessDojo Discord, or post the game right in the Discord and tag me, and I'll definitely take a look. Alright guys, hope you really enjoyed this video, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.